Okay, welcome. And today we're going to talk about a book called Gold Hunting in Alaska by Joseph Grinnell. So don't mind the little, hopefully you don't hear too much background noise here. The wood stove is crackling here. It's late March as I record this. It's still a little chilly outside. And so I'm in my fur shed and just kind of settled in here next to the warm fire. And we're gonna dig into this. So Gold Hunting in Alaska was published back in 1901, written in 1898 by a guy named Joseph Grinnell. And I'm going to talk about Joe Grinnell because a little bit before we get into this, because there's an interesting connection where that led me to finding out that this book even existed. I never knew about it. I wish I'd have known about it 10 years ago. But anyway, the name Grinnell kind of rung a bell for me because I've read a ton of stuff about the interior Alaska, about the history of wilderness trapping out there on the Yukon River and tributaries to the Yukon River. John McPhee's book, Coming into the Country. If you haven't read that, you really should. It's one of the best books that describes the area and the trappers out there. And homesteaders. And so in McPhee's book, he wrote about a number of people. One of the guys was a guy by the name of Dave Evans, and we'll get back to Dave in just a little bit. There was a follow-up book to McPhee's book by Dan O'Neill called A Land Gone Lonesome, and it kind of follows up in the same area in the upper Yukon, and looks at the land like 30 years after all of the homesteaders basically left or were kicked out by the government when land status changed along the Yukon River and the place became a park. But we'll get back to that in a minute. But as I started reading about these trappers and these people who settled and who adventured out in this area, I got to looking back into like the earlier part of the 20th century. And in particular, I read a number of books about trappers who were operating in that Fort Yukon area along the Yukon River and in the Yukon Flats and the mountains surrounding the Yukon Flats. There's a couple in particular. One was James Carroll, who wrote a book called Above the Arctic Circle, My First 10 Years in Alaska. That is an incredible story, and that's another one to tack that on your list. But about Carroll was there in the very early part of the 1900s, and then sometime around the early 30s, there was a family that settled in the Salmon River, which is nowadays known as the Shinjik River, a tributary to the Porcupine River. The Porcupine flows into the Yukon near Fort Yukon. And this family went by the last name of Berglund. The reason we know about them, George Berglund and his wife and a bunch of kids, is that one of the daughters, Evelyn Berglund, wrote a book called Born on Snowshoes. And the book describes her growing up essentially in the wilderness, born out in the bush. Her entire childhood, from the time she was born till the time she was in her early 20s, she was out on a wilderness trap line. They were out between when they started out, they were like, 50, 60 miles from town. And again, this is all travel that they were poling and hauling boat upriver with dogs, and just, it was really, they got motors later on, but early on, it was a lot of lining a boat, lining canoes, getting all their supplies up with just hard work. Later on, they ended up about over 200 miles up the Black River and up the Salmon Fork of the Black River, right along the Canadian border north of the Yukon. And they were out for usually for 9 or 10 months out of the year, and then they go into Fort Yukon for the summer to make a little money and to get their supplies and get ready for the following year. But as she got older, there's a long story there that we'll get into in a future video, but Evelyn was, I believe, in her early 20s, and she really wanted to get out and live. but the family kind of needed the girls. They had 3 girls and 3 boys, as I remember it. And sadly, one of the boys died at a young age of some sort of a rare disease, and the other 2 were murdered. They were drowned in the Yukon River. It was never proven, but they knew what happened. The law just did not. The local marshal in Fort Yukon at the time did not want to pursue anything. They knew the guy who did it. It was a crazy Indian guy that from up around Old Crow, and he didn't like them. He didn't like them being there, and he didn't like the boys. For whatever reason, he was out of his mind a little bit. It appeared. He threatened them previously, and then anyway, the boys died. So there were 3 daughters, and the husband George, he ended up going in an old folks home in Sitka, Alaska, the pioneers' home, because he had such crippling arthritis he could no longer take it. The mom, she ended up with another guy, another trapper, and they ended up trapping together. They got married eventually, but he was really old. He was like 20 or 30 years older than her, and his name was John Roberts. And they basically relied on these girls all through their teenage years to support the family. And without the girls to be out there on the trap line catching fur to pay for their living, they probably wouldn't have made it. And so the mother was really possessive, and she did not want her girls to leave, and she made it very difficult for them to do so. But anyway, Evelyn eventually, there was a trapper on the Kobuk River by the name of Bill Grinnell. And Bill Grinnell had heard rumor. He'd been trapping the Kobuk, I want to say, for like 10 years overall. But he'd just been there a few years, and at the time, he had heard rumor about some girls trapping up out of Fort Yukon and going up north. And he was looking for a wife. So one summer he went into Fort Yukon, and he met Evelyn, and they exchanged pleasantries and agreed to write to each other. And somehow it so happened that he said he was going to go and visit, and he showed up on a plane in the middle of the winter. And wanted to get married, and of course she wanted to get married as well. The mother would not allow it. They would not allow Bill to live in the house, but he got dropped off on the plane, so he ended up pitching a tent out somewhere off away from the cabin, and he spent the rest of the winter in a tent. And in the spring, when they went back to town, they got married. And then Bill Grinnell and Evelyn trapped and lived together, had kids. They trapped on the Kobuk, and then they went over to Beaver Creek, which is another tributary to the Yukon, downstream from Fort Yukon, near the village of Beaver. And this is all different stories, different books that we'll talk about in the future. But the name Bill Grinnell always stuck in my mind because of that particular story from that part of Evelyn Berglund Shore's book. I became acquainted with a guy by the name of Dave Evans, and Dave was, like I mentioned earlier, John McPhee's Coming Into the Country, Dan O'Neill's Land Gone Lonesome. There were a couple of other books. Melody Webb wrote a book called Yukon: The Last Frontier, and she went and looked at a lot of the history of settlement and people living in the upper Yukon. Dave Evans was featured in those books. And I wrote a book just recently, just about 5 years ago, called More Than Wolverine, and Alaska Wilderness Trapline, because I went to the area with a friend of mine, Jim Furman, and I trapped with him, and I learned a lot about the history, and I talked about all that in my book. This guy, Dave Evans, he left the bush many, many, many years ago. He now lives in New Hampshire, just a state over from me. And he read my book, and he got in touch with me, and we became pretty good acquaintances. And so we shared a lot of ideas, and shared libraries and book lists and everything. And he came over and visited me recently, a little while back now, and we talked a lot about stuff. It was really cool. So I think I gave him a book or two from my collection. When he got back home, he sent me, so he put together something for me that he copied, and it was pretty incredible. So Dave trapped in the Kobuk River in the same area that Bill Grinnell had trapped. Dave was there in the late 70s, and I believe it was the late 70s, and Grinnell had been there back in the 40s. So about 3 decades later, somehow through John McPhee, Grinnell wrote to McPhee after he read Coming into the Country, and was a real big fan of the book, and told McPhee about, how he had been there prior, and he knew a lot of the people that McPhee had wrote about in the book, and he was part of the stories that McPhee had told in the book. So that connection was made, and McPhee somehow connected Dave Evans with Bill Grinnell. Dave being on the Kobuk, he was getting mail out of Eagle just maybe a few times a year, which is a little community on the Yukon River off the end of the road. And then Grinnell was in Southern California in his early 70s, had been out of the bush for a long time, officially retired. They exchanged a lot of letters, and Dave was kind enough to share some of that with me. And so one of the best, my most valued pieces of my collection is some of these letters from Bill Grinnell to both John McPhee and to Dave Evans. But one of the letters, I had read these, I guess it would have been about 2 years ago now, and of course I read them over and over several times, but when I went away from them, I kind of forgot about a lot of it, and I had to kind of come back, and it's funny how this works. So things like stick in your head, and you don't always remember them right out, but when something else comes along and triggers your memory, all of a sudden somehow you can make another connection. And that's exactly what happened here. And so I'm going to find in just a minute here, I'm going to find the section that Grinnell wrote to Dave that kind of stuck in the back of my mind. Here it is. He says, toward the end of one of his letters, he says, yes, he was answering a lot of Dave's questions. He says, yes, my dad was a professor at University of California, Berkeley from 1908 to 1939. The winter of 1898-99, he spent on the Kobuk River with a party of gold prospectors, and he was among the first few hundred to hit the beach at Nome. His party had mining claims there which were stolen by a U.S. Marshal, and American soldiers drove them from their claims. And he goes on, talks about other stuff, but that little piece of information about his dad, Grinnell's dad, being part of the gold rush on the Kobuk and to Nome really stuck in the back of my mind. So I read a book called, just completely unrelated, called The Bear Man of Admiralty Island. And it was about a guy named, I'm not going to remember his name now. But anyway, the guy that lived on Admiralty Island in southeast Alaska, and he was a famous bear hunter, guide. He settled in that area on the Mole River in Mole Harbor, and he during the early Hasselborg, Alan Hasselborg was his name, and he became really famous throughout the country for being the bear guy. But during his early years, he met up, when he first moved out there, he met up with a scientific biological survey crew that was out there collecting specimens for a museum in California. They weren't very good hunters, and Hasselborg was a professional hunter. He was hunting bears for bounty at the time, or he was hunting them primarily, I think, to sell the pelts, the hides. So at some point, when he ran into these people, they hired him on as a hunter for the party. And so over the years, he continued to hunt and collect specimens, not just bears, but all kinds of different animals, birds, fur bears, everything that he could collect, and they would pay him, and he'd ship them off to this museum in California. The curator of the museum, in this book, there's letters back and forth between him and others that kind of helps paint a picture of Hasselborg's life. The guy's name was Joseph Grinnell. And so I'd never heard the actual Joseph Grinnell name before, but I thought, Grinnell, and the address said Berkeley, California. So this guy is a scientific guy. His name is Grinnell, and he's from California, from Berkeley. I wonder if this guy has any relation to Bill Grinnell. So I looked up Joseph Grinnell, and when I looked through on Wikipedia and looked through a bunch of stuff, all of a sudden I found a spot. 4 children, oldest child, son, Willard Grinnell. That was Bill. So then I started looking more in Joseph Grinnell's history, and I realized, boom, this guy, not only was he part of the Stampede to the Kobuk and then to Nome, what Bill Grinnell never told us about in these letters, he also wrote a book about it. And so we're going to get into this book called Gold Hunting in Alaska. Now, this was 1898. Joseph Grinnell was 21 years old at the time, just a kid. He had done a little bit of exploring. I guess he had an interesting childhood. So his father worked on like Indian reservations. I can't remember what his exact title was, but he worked with Indians on some reservations in the West, and he was moved around a little bit. They're basically what happened in the early 1890s. We don't hear about it much anymore because it's kind of overshadowed by the Great Depression in the late 1920s. But there was a huge economic depression like around 1893 or so. And so he ended up somehow, as part of that depression, lost his job, ended up moving to California, got a job in Southern California, and so the family settled there. This was Joe Grinnell's dad. So Joe was in Southern California. He was like fascinated by science. This guy had no interest. You'll see later on, and when you read this book, he had no interest whatsoever in gold and getting rich and prospecting and all that. He wanted adventure, but he wanted adventure because he was fascinated by wild animals, by wildlife. He was a major, major bird collector. The way people did it back then is they'd shoot them. They'd hunt to collect birds, and there were no rules on this stuff. They'd basically shoot anything they wanted, and they would shoot all different species of birds, and they would then he would like stuff them and mount them like a taxidermist does nowadays, and preserve them and add them to the collection. And he actually ended up with a collection before he died. Grinnell died at age 62 of a heart attack. But he ended up having a long career as a scientist, and a professor and a bunch of other things. But he ended up with a collection of like 900 birds in his lifetime. So it was a big deal to him. But he was part of this group of 20 men that formed the Long Beach in Alaska Mining and Trading Company. So this all started with the Kobuk Stampede. The Kobuk Stampede started in 1898. Now, if you remember the Klondike Gold Rush was, I believe, in like 1896 or 7. It was a little before this. And by the time 98 rolled along, some of the early people in the Klondike that staked claims and got on the rich ground, they got rich. They did really well. But most everybody that followed afterwards on the rush never made hardly any money. And some of them never found gold, and a lot of them just left, and they never even dug for gold. But at this time, the Klondike was kind of winding down, and people were actually leaving the Klondike and going other areas. There was a small rush to the Birch Creek area, which is a tributary to the Yukon River in the U.S. Of course, the Klondike was on the Canadian side. But there really wasn't much else going on. Now, there was a couple of rumors. So a guy named John Ross wrote a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle and said he he found $50,000 worth of gold on the Kobuk River in northwest Alaska. This is an incredibly remote area. And remember, back then, 1898, there is very little true in the way of transportation, mostly sailboats and potentially a little bit of steamship action, but that was about it. No flying, no planes, there was no roads or anything. This was the middle of nowhere, hundreds and hundreds of miles. Took months to get there. He said he found $50,000. There was a guy, I believe by the name of Cogan. He was a captain of a whaling ship, the whaling ship named Alaska. He came up with this fictitious story that a guy found $15,000 in gold after panning for 2 hours on the Kobuk. And it didn't really take much back in those days to get people going. These rumors circulated around the papers and everybody got psyched up. People were raising money, starting companies. Investors were piling a bunch of money in. And everybody geared up to head north. So this crew of 20 people from Southern California formed a company. They all put in their resources. Joe Grinnell at age 21, I think his parents were involved in helping him get his buy-in on this. But he ended up part of the company. He wasn't really interested in the gold so much as the adventure. He'd been to Alaska once before on a trip looking for wildlife and specimens, scientific collection, and he wanted to go back. So he became part of this crew. This was people that was from all walks of life. There was a doctor, a preacher, a undertaker. There were people who worked at all kinds of various different jobs and careers and professions, all different levels of education and background. Some of them sold everything they owned, their houses, gave up their life savings, left their wives and children so that they could jump on this boat. They bought 2 years worth of supplies. Remember, this was so remote. You get up there, you're not just going to be able to turn around and go back very easily. They expected to be there for a while. They bought 2 years worth of supplies. They bought this boat. It was a schooner. And I had to look this up. A schooner is a sailboat. So they had no engine power. They brought a couple of small engines for the riverboat that they were going to build when they got to the Kobuk. But they had this sailboat, this 72-foot long schooner, to go north on the Pacific Ocean, get to the Bering Sea, and get to Kotzebue, which is where the Kobuk enters the ocean. So they sailed, and so Grinnell was writing letters back to his family this whole time. Of course, you might meet a ship that's heading south, and you can give letters to them, and he might have only got return letters once or twice through the course, 2-3 times the course of the year, or whatever. There wasn't much communication, but he wrote letters constantly, very consistently, and it was essentially his way of keeping a journal or a diary. Later on, his mother, I believe it was, ended up publishing these into a book. But this was so incredibly valuable that he actually captured this as it was happening in such fine detail, and you'll see it here in the book how neat it is that he did that. And so it took them, I think it took them about 6 weeks to get up there. And so just a little background on this area. The Kobuk River is, let's see, it is about 280 miles long. This is a big river. Where it enters the ocean is an area called, it's in I guess it's the Kotzebue Sound, and the village of Kotzebue is actually a place today where about 4,000 people live, and it is a settlement. It's primarily Eskimos, I believe Inupiat Eskimos. Correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, but the Eskimo people lived up and down the coast in that entire area, And they're really, back in the day, in the late 1800s, they had lived there for thousands of years, but they didn't have many very, very large settlements. They were more scattered. And the reason for that is because they were spread out so that they could follow the food resources that were available to them in the shelter. And so a lot of times they would be, like in the winter, oftentimes, or certain times a year, they'd go inland and they'd hunt caribou. Other times a year, they'd be on the river, where they would fish for salmon that were coming up from the ocean to spawn. And then other times a year, they would be hunting out on the coast, hunting for whales or seals, on the ice, in cracks in the ice, on boats, on the edges of the ice, and so forth. So they moved around a lot. They were more tribal. They were smaller groups. It made more sense as far as hunting parties getting together and the resources in the areas to support people. But as civilization came along, what you notice in this book is this was the very first contact to speak of with whites and Eskimos. And a lot changed after first contact. And what eventually happened over the following decades was people started to gravitate towards central villages. And because there were more resources in the villages, they became transportation hubs with the advent of airplanes. Government became established, and then with government came schools, education, and also government aid, financial aid. And so people kind of found themselves gravitating toward these centralized villages. But back then it wasn't so big. Basically, they were mainly scattered up and down the coast. So this was so far north. This was like 35 miles above, or it was a number of miles above the Arctic Circle. And as they got up with their schooner, they were like skirting the edge of the ice, and it was July. It was like middle of July before the ice cleared enough for them to get to the mouth of the Kobuk River. That was pretty amazing. And this boat, the Penelope, the 72-foot schooner with the 20 guys, there were dozens of other boats coming up at the same time as them. They were kind of leading the pack a little bit, but there were tons and tons of people. So let's kind of read up a little bit on the Kobuk Stampede. We'll do a little Wikipedia on it, but basically it took them like 6 or 8 weeks, maybe 8 or 10 weeks. I can't remember. They left in early May, and it was sometime in mid-July when they, from California to the time they got to shore where they could stop at the mouth of the river and settle in and get ready to move upriver. And at that time, they got all their supplies together. They built a river boat, and they also built a barge. They had a motor, an engine that they had brought. I think it was a steam engine that they had brought on the Penelope to motor up the river with their river boat they built. And the Penelope, the captain, and a couple of other men basically stayed in the ship and overwintered and froze in, because everything that was only open for a few weeks out of the summertime, and that whole area froze in solid for most of the year. And actually the Eskimos had said that some years that there were some, like a couple years out of the previous dozen years, where the ice never opened up in the ocean there. It stayed ice covered all summer long. So these guys, this was pretty crazy. And they came in, they got their boat built. The ship froze in, and 3 or 4 guys just stayed there all winter long, keeping an eye on the ship, making sure. I guess if you were in a good sheltered harbor and the ice didn't move much, you could freeze in, and if you got lucky, it wouldn't destroy the ship. But if the ice moved a lot, and it could crush the ship and you'd be over. But they held a bunch of supplies at the ship, then they brought a bunch inland, and then they moved upriver and basically they just had a few weeks, build their boat, get as far upriver as they could. There wasn't even much time to prospect other than a little bit of panning here and there. They had to build cabins to spend the winter. And then the following spring, is when they expected the real gold mining to begin. But the Kobuk Stampede, Wikipedia tells us it was a brief gold rush on the Kobuk River in Alaska from 1897 to 98. Several false accounts of the discovery of gold on the Kobuk led nearly 2,000 gold seekers to the area. Most of these prospectors arrived by ship during the spring of 1898 from the west coast of North America. The gold rush was brief, with its peak from 1898 to 99, for local people spread the word upon arrival that no gold was to be found. Out of these 2,000 people, only 800 remained to search. Despite their efforts, only small amounts of placer and lode gold were discovered on a few of the Kobuk's tributaries. Other than gold deposits, copper, asbestos, and lead were also found. But basically, when the 2,000 people showed up there on the coast, they weren't the very first whites to contact any Eskimos, because there was a mission established by a local church. I want to say they were called the Friends, which I think might be Quakers, but I could be wrong. But there were missionaries there. They had a little mission established. They had a few Eskimos living there, and maybe a little school. And the missionaries and the Eskimos both told them, look, nobody has ever found any gold up the Kobuk. Promise you that. You're wasting your time. So the 2,000 people, about 1,200 left, just gone, because they had no reason to stay. It was only a few short weeks of summer. They wanted to get back home instead of spending the entire winter out there in the middle of nowhere when there's no gold in the area. There were 800 people who stayed on. The Penelope crew, the Long Beach, Alaska Mining and Trading Company, they were one of the groups that stayed on. So this was just really amazing how this all shaped up, how these guys kind of settled in. I would have loved to known, like, imagine if everybody who moved upriver and settled down for the winter kept a diary like Joe Grinnell. Like, if every camp had one person that kept a diary like that, it would be pretty amazing to see. But he explains it quite well. So we're going to get into that. But they ended up going up. I think they split up into two crews. One built a main cabin, which was like the big major place where the Penelope guys would stay. They call it Camp Penelope. And then a smaller group took the boat that they had built further upriver, like a long ways, like 150 miles maybe beyond them. I don't remember. They went way, way, way up, and they built a cabin there, and they wanted to get ahead in the springtime so they could go, they could prospect further upriver, because nobody really knew where to start. And so they split up, and essentially there was very little contact between the two crews for a very long time. But at some various points in the river, these 800 people were scattered about, and they just built their camps in almost seemingly random locations. They built cabins. They had basically not a lot of prospecting that could be done that time of year, and when they first started, they weren't really finding a lot anyway, and so they really didn't do. They didn't put a lot of effort into it after a while. It was like they're kind of waiting for someone to find out where the gold is. But I'm going to go through. So Gold Hunting in Alaska, published 1901. It's in the public domain, so it's easy to find. It's free. You can read it on Google Books for free, right online. You can also buy copies of it. I think I've seen them like $20 or $30 a copy. So I've got it up on my tablet here on Google Books, and I want to... I'm going to go back to one of the stories. By the time these guys got settled in, Grinnell was really excited. He was there to help with all the heavy lifting and the work, but by the time when he got free time, he was out collecting birds. He was hunting and looking for specimens, and then back at the camp, he was preserving them as in specimens and for long-term storage, so he could bring it back home. And he had a bunch of these stowed away at the ship from the trip as well. The Flying Dutchman. So there's all kinds of interesting people. When you have 800 people who leave their homes and go to the other end of the earth and inhospitable land and bring 2 years worth of supplies, you're going to have some interesting people. Last week, a German called at every camp on the Kobuk. And the Kobuk is another name for the Kobuk. They just called it, there were several different names that it was called. And Grinnell calls it Kowak, K-O-W-A-K. He was working up a winter mail route. He had skated up from the mouth of the river and proposed to take letters down to Cape Blossom for $1 each. A dollar each. This was 1898. This is a lot of money. A reindeer team is expected there from St. Michael's in December, which will bring in or carry back any mail. He is called the Flying Dutchman. And there's other competition for the Dutchman, but he's talking about all these schemes that people are coming up with to try to make money. The good thing about the Dutchman, though, is he actually had a map. He skated up and down the whole river to carry mail. He probably made more money than anybody else in that whole entire rush. But he had a detailed map of every camp, because he was the mailman. Every camp and their distances upriver and distances from each other. And later on in the book, he actually shared that with Grinnell. And Grinnell wrote it down. So he has every single camp listed at their different miles in the river. And that is just so fascinating to me. Like, I wonder 125 years later, is it possible that we could see signs of some of these old camps? Kind of cool. The area is mostly in a national park now, as far as I know. But anyway, Grinnell goes on after talking about the mailmen. He says, schemers are trying various ways to get money. The gold proposition here is an entire failure so far, and the stories published are no better than made up on purpose. It is supposed they were constructed by the transportation companies, and surely these have reaped a harvest this year. 1,000 men are in winter quarters in the Kotzebue region, besides the many who went back last thing in the fall. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were expended by parties coming here, and nothing is taken out. All of that money going to the transportation companies and merchants of San Francisco and Seattle. The H crowd alone, who are camped 5 miles below us, paid $31,000 for their outfit, including sailing vessel and river steamer. Part of this company got cold feet and went back, and the remainder have tons of provisions here to dispose of. They cannot get it into the interior to the Klondike regions, and so they'll have to transport it all the way back down the river, and so on to San Francisco, unless they can dispose of it on the way, which is not likely. It is strange how many fools were started to this country by bogus reports in the newspapers. Each party thought itself about the only one coming up here, and, what is most amusing, many of them had a sure thing. Several parties whom we know of paid someone for a tip as to the exact place where the gold was waiting for the lucky men to pick it up. When they arrived at the sound, they rushed as soon as their feet could carry them to take possession of their promised gold, only to find that they had been duped. They returned with righteous indignation burning in their bosoms, and to this day, for all time to come, justice is hiding for the scoundrels if they are found. This country may possibly have gold in it, for I know it's not been prospected as it should. This is interesting. Men pan out on a sandbar of a river here and there and are discouraged at finding nothing. And moreover, they will not do another stroke of work, but either return to the States or camp somewhere waiting for another man to sink shafts and do what we know is real prospecting. I should not be surprised if 3/4 of the people on this river are idle, waiting for the others to dig. I know that our camp has done practically nothing, as may be seen from the reports which I have made, when I myself was supposed to be one of the prospectors. We are all equally guilty. It seems that people expected to find mines all ready to work, and, since none are visible, sit down and give it up. Our company, as well as many another, is something of a farce when it comes to being a quote-unquote mining company. We are doing nothing. It seems that when the gold fever takes hold of a man, it deprives him of a fair proportion of his reasoning. But it cannot be denied that we are getting experience. Who would not be a miner under such comfortable circumstances as ours? Meanwhile, I am skinning mice and chickadees. I am doing exactly what I want to do. And work here is original work of which I shall be glad in time to come. I would be nowhere else in the world than right here now. One cannot take a stroll in the Arctics every day. I am resolved to remain as long as I can and improve my opportunities. If the company disbands, I shall stay with the missionaries. I do not know what this gold hunting expedition came up here for, unless to accommodate me, unintentionally, of course. Everything delights me, from the hoarfrost on my somewhat scanty though growing beard to the ice-locked Kobuk and its border of silver-laden spruces. And the ptarmigans, what beautiful birds, part and parcel in color and endurance of this frozen world. And the winter is not half over. What revelations when spring knocks at the barred doors. How alert the awakening landscape I can as yet only partially realize. That is just amazing. The guy is he's living the dream. He's living the dream up there with a bunch of stranded gold miners trying to eke the winter away. Oh yeah, by the way, the Flying Dutchman went by on November 7 and brought the mail, but he also brought some interesting news. Apparently, he met a man above the Par River, 175 miles east of us, who had just come over from the headwaters of the Kobuk River. And the Kobuk, if you don't know, was also a huge gold rush area. And it actually, unlike the Kobuk actually did have gold. Not enough to make people rich, but enough to have people mining there for quite a long time. The man reported that gold in large quantities had been found on a branch of the Kobuk River near its head, and that he and others had staked out rich claims. The Flying Dutchman also reported that 6 of our boys from the upper Penelope camp had already started with sleds for that region, and that Dr. Coffin had reached the Penelope camp in safety and was now on his way back to give us the news. We expect his party tonight. The news, if true, changes the whole aspect of things. We've heretofore had no assurance that gold had been found in this country, and we believed ourselves to be victims of fake stories. What a change of feeling in our camp. Although this report may also be a fake, we'll enjoy these happy expectations until further development. So anyway, what ended up happening there is the boys, they did go. They didn't get as far, I don't think, as they planned. They were ill prepared. They didn't have really good winter clothing. They were hauling all their supplies on sled by hand, no dogs, and they did sink a couple shafts, but they didn't really get a chance to fully prospect it. So anyway, moving on, I had a few other things I wanted to mention. Boy, he had a lot to say about the Indians. That was kind of interesting. Let's talk first about the different camps along the river. And the Flying Dutchman says, gave us a diagram of the Kobuk River with camps and distances as he judged them when skating up the river. I will record them beginning at Holtham Inlet. It may be years hence that some other prospecting parties will wend their way into these parts, and, seeing our deserted villages, pause in wonder at the lesson they teach. So he was even back then thinking of the importance of having this actually written down and recorded. The first camp, then 35 miles, in the Orphan's House, 1/2 mile, and Sprout's Camp, 9 miles. Riley's Wreck, 9 miles. Falkenberg Camp, 1 mile. Lower Kotzebue Camp, 12 miles. Indian Camp, 12 miles. Jesse Lou Camp, 12 miles. Sunnyside, 1/2 mile. Lower Hanson Camp, 3 miles. Lower Penelope Camp, our own. And Lower Iowa Camp, 4 miles. Guardian Camp, 30 miles. And he goes on and on. Ambler City, 3 miles. And I want you to remember Ambler City because there's a village on the Kobuk called Ambler, and I believe that is what they're referring to when they say Ambler City here. Ambler is actually a native village of Kobuk Eskimos that exists still today. There's a couple hundred people that live there, and it's a very interesting village when thinking back in history and looking forward to the future. So I'm going to mention that a little bit later on here. So he talks a lot about the Eskimos that were there in the Kobuk, and it was really fascinating. It's also a little bit sad how much changed with white contact, with civilization coming in. So these people lived a nomadic lifestyle, very solitary. They interacted occasionally with other tribes, but that was it. They lived in their own little world, and they had this entire area to themselves. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, 800 people come up their river and just settle in, and they're here and just completely take over. It's just mind blowing. And it in some ways, I can see where they would have been upset, but they don't really show that. That doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like they really they spent a lot of time with the white people, and they really enjoyed, first there was trade. They enjoyed trading for goods from the outside that they'd never seen before, and they were really fascinated by. Now, there had been some trading with the whaling ships, because whaling was a big industry in the late 1800s in that area. But still, they didn't have a lot of contact with and opportunity for a lot of stuff. So there was opportunity for trade, and then they basically just began to rely on the whites for a lot of the problems. Also, the incoming settlers brought with them unknowingly diseases that the Eskimos were not immune to, because they'd never experienced them in their genetic lineage. And so they got very, very sick. You know, it was sad. A lot of them died. And it seemed like from Grinnell's writings, it doesn't seem like anybody fully understood what exactly was going on there, and how the Indians and why the Indians were so much more susceptible. But the Indians had these very interesting rituals. When someone died in a house, they would abandon the house and never live there again. So they never wanted someone to die there. So when someone got really sick, they just toss them outside. They put up a little tent for them and just let them off on their own. They didn't really like to take care of sick people, because they were afraid, they were terrified that they were going to get it and everything. And so a lot of the sick people ended up going into the white camps, and like Penelope, like Grinnell's camp, they took care of a lot of them and nursed them back to health. Some of them did end up dying anyway, but they were able to nurse several of them back to health. But it was a really, really different thing. And then he took pictures of the burial grounds when people did die. They didn't bury them, of course, which would be difficult to do in the frozen ground, but they put them up on poles, on like platforms up above the ground, like 6 or 8 feet off the ground. They just put their bodies up there, and then all the things that the person had for possessions when they were alive, they were placed next to them in their burial site. Which Grinnell kind of commented, like, it seems kind of odd. These people are starving, barely getting by, and they don't have the tools they need, and they're putting these valuable items with the bodies of the dead people. But they believed that was going to be with them in the next life, and so they had to have something with their body when they were put away. So anyway, that kind of culminates later on with it. You know, we talk about a lot of the experience with the Indians and the great things, and the dancing and the culture, and really a lot of the interactions. But at some point, it was kind of having an impact on both parties. So here on page 54, he says, "We do not feed the Indians anymore at all, and it is better for them. They have become so dependent on the whites that they do not work for themselves anymore. When they might be fishing or trapping, they are hanging around our cabins. They do not visit us as often now as in the fall. Rivers and I send them outside whenever mealtime comes, and they're beginning to learn. We must do this or suffer ourselves from hunger in a late spring." And so they got into the habit, instead of going out and doing what they'd traditionally done, hunting and fishing, trapping, collecting food, the culture was different. Like what he talks about, going into igloos, which were essentially like skin tents that were covered in snow and stuff. They weren't like what you might think of an igloo, but he would be traveling on the river, and they'd find an Eskimo igloo and go in and visit, and the Eskimos would bring out like all of their finest food that they had saved up. They had blueberries they'd picked in the fall and summer. They had the best salmon that they'd caught, and they were giving it to them, and they like gave freely. Their culture was so much associated with freely giving and not so much with saving. And so they expected the white people to do the same thing. And so they expected, well, we go to your camp, you should give us your food too. And our culture, the more Anglo-Saxon culture, was more associated with saving what you have and making sure that you have enough for the future, because hard times will come and you'll never get ahead. Whereas the Eskimos were so used to going through those tough times and just moving and doing other things. They spent all of their resources looking for food because they had to, because they didn't have anything saved up. But anyway, there were just a lot of interesting interactions. There was something toward the end that I thought was, I don't remember if, I do have it. I did really want to read this, and I got to go back. But while we're on if I was more of a professional, I would probably have all of these, all this pulled up ahead of time. But I'm just going back and forth here on some notes that I made. When they left in the springtime, they went down river after the ice let out. He talks about a lot of the experiences. Oh, that they had, and he kind of reminisces a little bit on the change, on what they experienced and what the natives experienced. He called them Indians in some places, Eskimos in some. The Kobuk people were actually, I believe they were known as an inland Eskimo. So they kind of lived similar to Indians in some ways and similar to the Eskimos in others. They were kind of the bridge between the coast-dwelling Eskimos who just lived off the ocean and the interior Athabascan Indians who lived just off of the forest. They were a little bit of both. And actually, I've read several books about the interaction between the inland the Eskimos and the Indians, and the upper Kobuk ones in particular. There's a lot of documentation about that, and there was a lot of animosity and there was a lot of fear among both, because they had fierce battles and many times killed each other. There were also periods of times where they traded with each other. So just a really fascinating history there. So on page 81, going towards the end, he said, this morning, this is when they're heading downriver going to the ocean. They're actually heading to Nome. And so long story short, by the time spring started to come along, everybody in the Kobuk Stampede, most of them were going to go back to California. They'd given up. A few were going to stick around and try to prospect. Just around that time, perfect timing, someone discovered rich gold on the beaches of Nome. And all of a sudden, they didn't have to go back to California, and they were in perfect position. They were some of the closest people to Nome, and they got there first. Which was pretty incredible, just by virtue of having spent the winter on the Kobuk. So he says, just this morning we passed a camp of natives. 6 of their kayaks came out and followed us a long way. They could sail circles around the scow. They were very dexterous with their funny craft. Just before leaving us, they sang in chorus, "There'll be a hot time." Evidences of the great Kobuk Rush will be found among the Eskimos in their language as well as in other ways for many years to come. And so just that winter with those 800 gold rushers, think about the cultural interactions and the things that the natives had brought into their culture that would last for a very long time. Isn't that incredible? That to go from such an isolated state for thousands of years, and then all of a sudden have this clash and be exposed to all this stuff that completely changes the way you see things and what you know about the world and life. So that was cool. That was interesting. There were a few other things that I wanted to point out. So there was something that Grinnell talks about. So these guys were out on the Kobuk, and they were like living life. They weren't just like getting by and surviving. they were they built their cabins. They had all their food. They had all their supplies. They had instruments. They built furniture. They built a little church at the back of Camp Penelope, and they had Sunday services every Sunday. They had a literary society where they sat down and discussed books. They had meetings, weekly meetings, where they had like elected officials, and they would give talks. A different person every week would give a talk on their specialty and their career back home, and teach people about different aspects of, like, the doctor might give a seminar on frostbite or scurvy, which was a big problem in that area, and how to prevent it. There was a guy who was a printer, a professional printer, and he's talking about photographs and all that. And, the Undertaker talked about, it's just pretty cool that they did all this stuff. They had these societies. They visited each other. They celebrated holidays. They had big feasts and meals and parties. They did a bunch of stuff. But there was also status and on life on the Kobuk. If I can find this, page 60. Let's see. There's a place that Grinnell mentions called Quality Hill. And I thought there really wasn't anything historically significant of this. I just thought it was hilarious. It was just funny. It was just odd, ironic, I guess you might say. Joe Jury took the chair, which I had vacated today, chair of this literary society, and made things lively, using a big hand axe for a gavel and otherwise making this, probably our final meeting, a merry one. Several of the Kobuk men are about to leave. 9 of the Sunnysiders started up yesterday with their sled loads. They have lots of courage and perseverance, but I doubt they're making the mountain passes with their supplies. Salisbury and Joe Jerry start down tomorrow on a 3-week trip to look after the condition of their barge, 68 miles below us. Dr. Gleaves and the boys from Quality Hill are getting ready for a hunting trip across the Natak. I think that's the Noatak River. Oh, I believe I've not made previous mention of Quality Hill. It is an interesting spot, the cabin being occupied by 4 young men of the aristocracy. They have been exclusive as became men of their distinction. Few of us have been on intimate terms with them, but they are said to lie in their bunks until 12 o'clock noon and to stay up, when once out, until 2 the following morning. They divert themselves by shooting at mice which run across the floor, using their 6-shooters. Various boxes and knot holes about the walls of their residence suggest targets. The walls themselves are riddled with bullet holes. They are said to have trained a young Eskimo as personal attendant, who does all the work of the cabin, building fires, bringing wood and water, and even cooking. He sleeps on the floor so he may lie handy to rekindle the fires of a cold night. The first man to arouse in the morning tosses a boot or other article at the native servant, which reminds him of his domestic duties. He blacks their mucklucks, it is rumored, and serves coffee and cigars in bed. They live in style on Quality Hill. Thus even the remote Kobuk has its aristocratic society. It's just insane. 1898. Okay, so that's Quality Hill. Interesting point to make. We're talking about the literary society. And so I wanted to mention something about, there was a poem that the doctor, one of Joe's good friends, wrote. And the doctor and Joe were pretty close. They're like intellectually, they're both very similar. And the doctor actually took up hunting with Joe for specimens, and he really enjoyed it, and they became good hunting partners for the good part of the winter. But this is the reason I wanted to share this, is that this really stuck with me. This hit me like personally, and I've been thinking about this poem for the last few weeks since I've read this book. It just really hit me. It hit home really close, and it really, to me, it's about how we change over time as human beings, and how the person you are changes and the way you see the world changes over the years as you grow old with age and experience. And this was just such an incredible little poem that just summed up this entire concept. Joe says, I've been reading A Scientific Demonstration of the Future Life by Hudson, which is a book I've never heard of. It interested me very much, and the doctor and I got into many a warm argument over it. It is a strange fact that we never argue upon subjects we agree upon. I always stick to my sharp point and he to his. Our discussions are usually on some biological topic, and the rest of the men do not know what we're talking about. One night, after a long argument in which I would not yield a single point when the doctor thought I ought, he wrote me the following. A couple of quick points of explanation. Mon ami is French for my friend, and then they called him, his nickname was Chickadee Joe, because of his love of birds and stuffing birds like chickadees and stuff. So this is the poem. Mon ami Joe, a thing I know is you are Joe. Why this is so, I do not know, but well I know you will be Joe, until you go from earth below. But even so, my young friend Joe, before you go, you'll not be Joe, the same I know, for you will grow, both old and slow, and fall below to what you'd grow, in things to know of what is so. On things you know and say are so, hard winds will blow, and light will grow, and change them so, you will not know that they are so. And then, by Joe, you'll be more slow to say you know a thing is so, 'cause then you'll know that what was so when you were Joe may not be so when you're not Joe. And that is so, which was not so when you were Joe, down here below. I like you, Joe, I'd have you know, and that is so because you're Joe. And be it so, mon ami Joe, as to and fro the world you go, that which you know, declare 'tis so, and so be Joe, the Joe I know, Chickadee Joe. Read that a couple times. That really had an impact on me, because it rhymes so well with my life and some of the ways that I've looked at things and how things have changed over time. A couple more points I wanted to make with this. I know I'm carrying on. The sand dunes. He mentioned several times sand, the dunes, going to the dunes in the middle of the winter. He talks about the sand blowing across the river and covering the ice in midwinter, and they couldn't travel with sleds because the sand on the surface of the ice. It didn't hit me at first. At first it seemed kind of odd, and then I remembered the Kobuk Sand Dunes. So I gotta read you a little something on that because it is absolutely incredibly fascinating. The Kobuk Sand Dunes. There are two areas of sand dunes in Alaska. Most people don't know. I never knew before this last 6 months or so. I didn't even know sand dunes existed in Alaska. And I read this article on I think they're called the Niobrara Sand Dunes in interior Alaska. But they also mentioned these Kobuk dunes. So what the heck are the Kobuk Sand Dunes? And if you see pictures of these are pretty incredible. And they go right across the Kobuk River at one spot. And I'm assuming that where this Camp Penelope was, where these guys were, it was somewhat close to the dunes. Because Joe talks about going to the dunes. He went to the dunes one time to test his winter gear and see if he could keep the cold wind out of his face with the hood that he had made. Stuff like that. So here from the National Parks Service, the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes. One of Kobuk Valley National Park's most iconic sites is the Great Kobuk Sand Dunes rising unexpectedly out of tundra and trees. These dunes, the largest active sand dunes in the Arctic, along with the smaller Little Kobuk Sand Dunes and Hunt River Sand Dunes, create 30 square miles of towering sand that would look more at home in the Sahara than 35 miles above the Arctic Circle. It says they're a relic from the past. Kobuk Valley's sand dunes are a relic of the last ice age, 28,000 years ago. The earth cooled and the glaciers began to form high in the mountains surrounding the valley. Over time, the slow, grinding advance and retreat of the glaciers ground the rocks beneath them into a fine sand, which was blown by the wind into the sheltered, ice-free Kobuk Valley. When the glaciers began to retreat 14,000 years ago, they left behind 200,000 acres of rolling sand dunes along the banks of the river. Over time, however, vegetation has reclaimed all but 16,000 acres. So there were 200,000 acres of these, and they've grown in now to where they're covered in forest, and there's 16,000 acres left of actual active dunes. Continues to slowly eat away at the margins of the dunes, so it's continually growing in every year. Sparse grasses, sedges, wild rye, and the occasional wildflower, including the Kobuk loco weed, which is only found on the slopes of Kobuk Valley sand dunes, grow in the shifting sand of the dunes. These plants stabilize the sand and pave the way for a succession of mosses and algae, lichen, and shrubs before the aspen, birch, and spruce of the forest take root. So yeah, they talk more about life on the dunes. You can go there, you can visit them, you can actually fly and land a plane there, you can set up a tent, I guess. So yeah, they're just a pretty incredible, unique area. And just to think that over 125 years ago they went there, they kind of just mentioned the dunes in passing, but it's like, man, this is something else, and the dunes are still there all these decades later, and presumably untouched. There are some signs of, they say, of ancient activity from hunters. It says people have lived in the Kobuk Valley for at least 8,000 years, primarily on the banks of the fish-filled Kobuk River, but they also relied on the unique landscape of the sand dunes to hunt large animals. Evidence of hunting camps dating back thousands of years dot the edge of the dunes. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And I think that was it, except one more point. So this great gold rush ended in basically disappointment. No gold in the Kobuk, a few other minerals, nothing really to speak of. 125 years later, something has happened. And I want to mention one name because in some of the other stuff I've read in Eskimo folklore and Eskimo culture, there was a name of a guy called Maniilaq. And this was a legendary individual. He was an actual person, not a legend. Supposedly. He was a person who lived in the 19th century before colonists arrived in his area of northwest Alaska, in this general Kobuk area. He lived as a hunter and a healer in northwest Alaska. Various stories about him include that he heard voices predicting people would come to Alaska. He had prophetic visions of boats that were propelled by fire or that flew in the air. So, the steamships, outboard motor, planes. He, in the 1800s, long before any of this contact with whites, he apparently had prophecies of this, of people coming into this area. And he heard voices from a higher power who he said identified as Abba. Some say that Maniilaq rested every seventh day. Other prophecies attributed to Maniilaq include the prophecy, and this is the one that really stuck with me. He prophesied that the village of Ambler, Alaska, would one day become a large metropolis, and that a whale would swim upriver and appear at Ambler, which is another story. But Maniilaq, the most distant future event he predicted was he predicted a day that was split in two, which is, they're saying, is probably a reference to the solar eclipse that's going to happen July 1, 2057. So that's interesting. But I'm assuming that means that they're going to see that solar eclipse in that area. But he was well known for predicting this. Ambler would become a large metropolis. Ambler is a village right now of about 250 people on the banks of the Kobuk River. Isolated, only get there by air or by a long ride on a boat. And there has been no population growth to speak of. People from surrounding areas consolidated into the village over time, but it is not a large metropolis. However, something has changed in the last few years. And if you look up a company called Ambler Metals, and if you Google the Ambler Road, And you read any of Seth Kantner's recent writings. Seth is a famous author from Kotzebue and grew up in the Ambler area. You will know that even though they didn't find minerals near the surface, deep down underground, there is some of the most valuable deposits of minerals in the world around Ambler, Alaska. So did Maniilaq know something? Right now, in 1980, the Alaska National Interest Land Claims Act put in place all of the different federal ownership and ownership of different lands in Alaska and split up state and federal ownership. As part of that, this area became a national park. Much of it became a national park. Much of it was reserved as state land. Much of it is tribal land. But the state secured a right-of-way to build a road through the area, through Gates of the Arctic National Park, from the oil pipeline, from the Dalton Highway, the Haul Road, to the Ambler area for mineral exploration and development of mines. That is in law. However, when they pushed through, they've been pushing lately, the state has applied for approval to put in this road, and under the Biden administration, the Bureau of Land Management denied the permits for the road because it's a whole nother story. We could spend another hour on it, but it would involve incredible levels of environmental impact because of the distance and the area that's being traveled in this road. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of culverts and many, many bridges crossing salmon spawning streams. And it would be a massive change. And just in the last month, as I record this, the Trump administration has reversed the Biden decision on development in this area and has put in place an executive order to unleash Alaska's minerals. And as a result, for better or worse, and I can see both sides of this issue. I'm not really taking a side on either end, but it appears as though some people are poised to build this road and develop. There's a joint venture between two major mining companies who have claims in the area and are exploring it right now. Some major mining areas around Ambler. And so it makes you wonder, 125 years after gold hunting in Alaska, Joseph Grinnell's journey, and the whole prophecy from Maniilaq of Ambler becoming a metropolis, what's going to happen here in the future? It's so fascinating. So that is gold hunting in Alaska. I hope you enjoyed the long rambling and all the different connections, but that's what I'm going to do here in this whole, whatever this thing is that I'm doing. I'm going to get into these books and get into the history and share with you the things that fascinate me, because I think and I hope that some of you will be fascinated by them as well. Thanks for listening in.